2007, archaeologists broke through the floor of a Roman palace. They were looking for ancient mosaic, pottery, maybe some coins, standard archaeological work. What they found instead was a tomb, but not for emperors or generals or anyone important. This was a tomb for babies. 100 infant skeletons buried in the sewage system beneath the palace. No coffins, no ceremony, no markers, just tiny bones wrapped in cloth and thrown into the dark like garbage. Some were newborns, some were a few weeks old. Some showed signs of trauma, broken bones, fractured skulls, evidence of violence. And all of them, every single one, had died in the same place, in the palace above. This is the story they tried to bury 2,000 years ago. The scandal that archaeologists accidentally uncovered, and the question that still haunts historians today. Who killed 100 babies? And why did nobody stop them? Imagine you're an archaeologist. You've spent your entire career studying ancient Rome. You've excavated temples, forums, amphitheaters. You've seen artifacts that most people only read about in history books. You think you've seen everything the ancient world has to offer. And then you find this, a mass grave of infants hidden beneath what was once one of the most luxurious palaces in the Roman Empire. Your first thought is disease. Maybe a plague swept through. Maybe these were children who died naturally and were buried together out of necessity. But then you start examining the bones more closely, and you realize something is very, very wrong. Because these children didn't die from disease. The bones tell a different story. Fractures that could only come from violent impact. Skull damage consistent with blunt force trauma. And the way they were buried, hastily, without ceremony. Hidden in the sewage system like they were something shameful. Something that needed to be concealed. This wasn't a tragedy. This was a crime scene. A crime scene that's been hidden for 1,600 years. And now, with modern forensic technology, with DNA analysis and bone density studies and isotope testing, we can finally start to piece together what happened in that palace. Who lived there? Who died there? And who killed 100 babies and got away with it for 2,000 years? Here's what we know for certain. The palace was located in Ashkelon, an ancient Roman city on the coast of what is now Israel. In the 4th century AD, Ashkelon was a thriving port city, wealthy, cosmopolitan, a place where Roman officials, merchants, and aristocrats built elaborate homes and lived in luxury. The palace where the babies were found was one of the largest in the city. Multiple rooms, elaborate floor mosaic, evidence of wealth and high social status. Whoever lived there was important, powerful, connected. And for decades, maybe longer, babies were dying in that palace, regularly, systematically, and someone was disposing of the bodies in the sewage system beneath the building. The archaeologists who discovered the site in 2007 were stunned. They'd been excavating in Ashkelon for years. They'd found artifacts, pottery, evidence of daily life in ancient Rome, but nothing like this. 100 infant skeletons, all buried in the same location, all dating to roughly the same time period, all showing signs of having died shortly after birth. This wasn't normal. Even in ancient times, even in a world where infant mortality was high and medical care was primitive, this was unusual. Because these babies weren't buried in a cemetery. They weren't given any kind of funeral rites. They were hidden, concealed, disposed of like trash. And that raises a question that's impossible to ignore. Why? Let's go back to the 4th century. Let's try to understand what life was like in that palace. Who lived there? What happened behind those walls? Because the answer to who killed these babies is hidden somewhere in the daily life of ancient Rome. In the social structures, the power dynamics, the secrets that aristocratic families kept. The Roman Empire in the 4th century was in transition. Christianity was spreading. The old pagan religions were losing influence. Social norms were changing. But some things hadn't changed. Women, especially women in wealthy families, were still treated as property. They were married off to secure political alliances. They were expected to produce heirs. And if they failed, if they couldn't give their husbands sons, they could be divorced, disgraced, or worse. Slaves had even fewer rights. They were property. They could be bought, sold, used, and discarded. And if a slave woman became pregnant, especially if the father was her master, that child had no legal status, no protection, no rights at all. In this world, babies died all the time. Stillbirths, disease, accidents. It was tragic, but it was normal. But what happened in that palace in Ashkelon wasn't normal. 100 babies don't die naturally in the same location over the course of a few decades, unless something deeply wrong is happening. So what was happening? That's what we need to figure out. The first theory that archaeologists considered was infanticide, the deliberate killing of unwanted infants. And here's something that modern people find deeply disturbing. Infanticide was not uncommon in ancient Rome. It wasn't celebrated, it wasn't talked about openly, but it happened regularly, especially among the wealthy. Here's how it worked. In Roman society, when a baby was born, the father had absolute authority over whether that child would be accepted into the family. This was called patria potestas, the power of the father. If the father decided the child was acceptable, healthy, legitimate, the child would be acknowledged and raised. But if the father rejected the child, for any reason, the child would be exposed. That's the term they used. Exposure. It meant taking the newborn baby and leaving it outside to die. Sometimes they'd leave the baby at a crossroads, sometimes in the wilderness, sometimes in a public place where someone might take pity and adopt the child, though that rarely happened. The baby would die of exposure, starvation, or be eaten by animals. And legally, this was not considered murder. It was considered the father's right, his choice, his property. Now, why would a Roman father reject a child? There were many reasons. If the baby was deformed or sickly, it might be rejected. If the family already had too many children and couldn't afford another mouth to feed, it might be rejected. If the baby was a girl and the family wanted sons, it might be rejected. And if the baby was illegitimate, born from an affair or from a slave, it would almost certainly be rejected. This practice was so common that early Christian writers, when they were trying to convince Romans to convert, would point to exposure as evidence of Rome's moral corruption. They'd say, "Look at what you're doing. You're killing babies. You're leaving them to die. How can you call yourself civilized?" And some Romans agreed. By the 4th century, when Christianity was gaining influence, attitudes toward infanticide were starting to shift. It was becoming less acceptable, more shameful. But it was still happening, especially in private, behind closed doors, where nobody could see. So here's the question. Were the babies found in Ashkelon victims of exposure? Were they unwanted infants whose fathers rejected them and whose bodies were hidden in the sewage system to avoid scandal? That was the first theory. And for a while, it seemed to fit. But then the forensic analysis came back, and it revealed something that changed everything. The babies weren't just newborns. Some of them had lived for weeks, long enough to be fed, long enough to be cared for, and then they died, all at once. And the way they died, the bone fractures, the skull trauma, it wasn't consistent with exposure. It wasn't consistent with neglect. It was consistent with violence. Someone had killed these babies, deliberately, violently, and then hidden the evidence. This wasn't exposure. This was murder. And that raises a much darker question. Who was killing babies in that palace, and why? Let's talk about another possibility. And this one is going to be deeply uncomfortable, but we have to consider it, because the evidence points in this direction. Brothels. In ancient Rome, prostitution was legal and regulated. There were brothels in every city. Some were small, operated by 1 or 2 women working independently. Others were large, commercial operations run by pimps who owned dozens of slaves. And here's the part that's hard to talk about. When prostitutes became pregnant, which happened regularly because contraception was unreliable and abortion was dangerous, they had a problem. A baby was bad for business. It meant time off work. It meant medical expenses. It meant a mouth to feed. And if the prostitute was a slave, which most of them were, the baby belonged to the owner, not to the mother. The owner could sell the baby, or kill it, or simply let it die. Nobody would care. Nobody would investigate, because slaves weren't people. They were property, and the children of slaves had no rights at all. Now here's where it gets relevant to our story. The palace in Ashkelon, the one where the babies were found, was large, very large, too large for a single family. And the layout of the building, with multiple small rooms, separate entrances, and evidence of heavy foot traffic, suggested it might not have been a private residence. It might have been a commercial building, a bathhouse maybe, or a tavern. Or, and this is the theory that some historians find most convincing, a high-end brothel. A place where wealthy Roman men would go to pay for sex with beautiful slaves. A place where pregnancies would be common, and where unwanted babies would need to be disposed of quietly and efficiently. The evidence for this theory is circumstantial, but compelling. First, the location. Ashkelon was a port city. Sailors, merchants, soldiers, they all passed through. And port cities always had a thriving sex trade. Second, the building itself. Luxurious, but designed for traffic, not a family home. Third, the number of babies. 100 infants over a few decades. That's a lot of pregnancies. More than you'd expect from a single family, but consistent with a brothel where dozens of women were working. And fourth, the way the babies were hidden. In the sewage system, out of sight, not in a cemetery where questions might be asked. This suggests that whoever was disposing of the bodies wanted to avoid attention, wanted to keep this secret. Because even in ancient Rome, where infanticide was legal under certain circumstances, there were limits. If people found out that babies were being killed regularly in a specific location, there would be questions, investigations, scandal, so the bodies were hidden, thrown into the sewage system where they wouldn't be found. And for 1,600 years, nobody knew they were there. Until 2007, when archaeologists broke through the floor and discovered the mass grave, and the world finally learned what had been happening in that palace. But here's the problem with this theory. It's logical, it fits the evidence, but it's not proven, because we don't know for certain what kind of building this was. We don't know who lived there, what activities took place inside. We can make educated guesses based on the architecture and the artifacts found at the site, but we can't be certain. So the question remains, who killed these babies? Let's consider another possibility, and this one is even darker. What if the babies weren't killed because they were unwanted? What if they were killed for a different reason entirely? What if they were sacrificed? Human sacrifice in the Roman Empire was officially illegal by the 4th century. The practice had been banned for hundreds of years, but that doesn't mean it didn't happen, especially in private, especially among people who practiced the old religions, the pagan cults that predated Christianity. Some of these cults, particularly those associated with fertility goddesses, underworld deities, had traditions involving infant sacrifice. The idea was that offering a newborn child, an innocent life, would gain favor with the gods. It would bring fertility, prosperity, protection. And while Rome had officially moved away from these practices, there were still people, especially in distant provinces like Ashkelon, who secretly maintained the old tradition. Now, is there evidence that the babies in Ashkelon were sacrificed? Not direct evidence, no. But there are some details that make historians wonder. The number of babies. 100 is a significant number in many ancient religious traditions. The way they were buried, together, in a specific location, almost ceremonially, even though there were no markers. And the fact that this continued for decades, regularly, systematically. If this was random infanticide, you'd expect the bodies to be scattered, hidden in different locations. But these babies were all in the same place, under the same building, as if that location had significance, as if there was a ritual element to what was happening. But here's the problem with the sacrifice theory. There's no evidence of ritual objects, no altars, no inscriptions, no artifacts that would suggest religious activity. And sacrifice victims in ancient cults were usually treated with more ceremony. Their bodies would be prepared, offerings would be left with them. There would be ritual elements that archaeologists could identify. None of that was present in Ashkelon. So while sacrifice is possible, it's not the most likely explanation. Which brings us back to the question, if these babies weren't exposed because they were unwanted, and they weren't sacrificed as part of a religious ritual, then what happened to them? There's one more possibility we need to consider, and this one is the most disturbing of all. What if the babies were killed to hide evidence? Evidence of rape, of incest, of crimes that powerful people didn't want exposed. Think about it. Ancient Rome was a hierarchical society. Masters had absolute power over their slaves. Fathers had absolute power over their daughters. And if a powerful man raped a slave or committed incest with a family member, the resulting pregnancy would be a scandal. It would threaten his reputation, his political career, his family's honor. So how do you solve that problem? You get rid of the evidence. You kill the baby, and you hide the body where nobody will find it. This happens more often in history than we like to admit. Powerful men committing crimes and then covering them up by murdering anyone who could expose them. Even babies, especially babies, because babies can't fight back, can't tell anyone what happened, can't testify against their killers. Now, do we have proof that this is what happened in Ashkelon? No. But we have circumstantial evidence that points in this direction. The palace was large and wealthy. It was owned by someone important, someone with resources, someone who could get away with murder. The babies all died at roughly the same age, shortly after birth, before they could be seen by too many people, before questions could be asked. And the bodies were hidden in a location that only someone with access to the palace could use. The sewage system wasn't public. It was beneath the building. You'd need to be inside the palace to dispose of bodies there. So whoever was killing these babies had regular access to that building. They lived there, or worked there, or owned it. And they had the power to commit these crimes repeatedly, for decades, without being caught. That level of power and secrecy suggests someone at the very top of the social hierarchy. Someone who believed they were untouchable. And in ancient Rome, that meant someone with wealth, political connections, and the ability to intimidate anyone who might speak out. So what do we do with this information? How do we figure out who this person was? This is where modern forensic science becomes crucial, because in 2007, when these skeletons were discovered, archaeologists didn't just catalog them and put them in a museum. They subjected them to cutting-edge analysis, DNA testing, isotope analysis, bone density studies, everything that modern science could throw at these ancient bones. And what they found was shocking. The DNA analysis revealed something unexpected. The babies weren't all from different mothers. In fact, many of them shared maternal DNA. They were siblings, half-siblings, born to the same women over multiple pregnancies. This changes everything. Because if these babies were siblings, if they came from a small group of mothers who were repeatedly getting pregnant, that rules out random infanticide. It rules out a brothel where different women would be giving birth. It suggests something much more targeted. A specific group of women, probably slaves or low-status servants, who were being impregnated repeatedly. And every time they gave birth, the baby was killed. Why? Who would do that? And who were these mothers? The isotope analysis provided another clue. By studying the chemical composition of the bones, scientists can determine where a person lived and what they ate. And the isotope signatures from the baby skeletons showed that the mothers were local to Ashkelon. They weren't foreigners. They weren't traveling prostitutes brought in from other cities. They lived in that palace permanently. They were part of the household. They ate the same food, drank the same water, and year after year, they got pregnant. And year after year, their babies disappeared. Can you imagine what that must have been like? To be one of those women? To give birth knowing that your child would be taken from you and killed? To go through that trauma once, twice, 5 times, 10 times, and have no power to stop it? Because if these women were slaves, and all evidence suggests they had no rights, no voice, no ability to refuse or resist. They were property, and their children were property, and whoever owned them had the legal right to do whatever they wanted. Now let's talk about who might have owned this property. Who had the wealth and power to own a palace in Ashkelon? Who had the moral corruption to kill babies systematically for decades? We don't have a name. The building wasn't labeled. There are no inscriptions identifying the owner, but we can make educated guesses based on what we know about Roman society in the 4th century. Ashkelon was an important city, a port, a center of trade, the kind of place where Roman governors, military commanders, and wealthy merchants would live. And the palace where the babies were found was one of the largest in the city. So we're talking about someone at the very top of society, someone with significant wealth and political influence, someone who could commit crimes and never face consequences because they controlled the local legal system. There are a few possibilities. 1. A Roman governor. These were the highest officials in provincial cities. They had near absolute power. They could kill with impunity as long as they didn't anger Rome itself. If a governor wanted to rape his slaves, impregnate them, and then kill the babies to hide the evidence, nobody in Ashkelon could stop him. 2. A wealthy merchant, someone involved in the slave trade or some other lucrative business. These men had money, but not official political power. But money buys influence. It buys silence. If a merchant wanted to run a brothel and dispose of unwanted babies, he could pay off local authorities to look the other way. 3. A religious leader. This might sound surprising, but the 4th century was a complicated time religiously. Christianity was spreading, but pagan cults were still active. Some pagan temples owned significant property and had their own private compounds. If a cult was practicing secret rituals, including infant sacrifice, they'd need a secure location. A palace with a hidden sewage system would be perfect. 4. A military commander. Roman soldiers had a reputation for brutality. If a legion was stationed in Ashkelon, their commander would have had a private residence, staff, and slaves. And if that commander was particularly cruel, if he saw his slaves as disposable, he might have treated them exactly the way these women appear to have been treated. We don't know which of these scenarios is correct. Maybe it was a combination. Maybe multiple people were involved. Maybe the palace changed hands over the decades, and different owners continued the same horrific practices. But what we do know, what the bones prove beyond any doubt, is that someone in that palace was committing murder, repeatedly, systematically, for decades, and they got away with it until 2007, so when the truth finally came to light. Now let's talk about something that makes this story even more disturbing. The mothers. We know from DNA analysis that many of the babies came from the same women. Women who were impregnated multiple times. Women who gave birth and watched their children die again and again. But here's the question nobody wants to ask. Did these women know what was happening? Did they understand that their babies were being killed? Or were they told the babies died naturally? Were they lied to? We'll never know for certain. But based on what we understand about Roman slavery, it's likely these women knew exactly what was happening, and they were powerless to stop it. Slaves in ancient Rome had no legal protection against rape. Masters could use their slaves sexually whenever they wanted. Impregnating a slave wasn't a crime. It wasn't even frowned upon. It was considered normal, and if a slave gave birth, the child belonged to the master, not to the mother. The master could kill the child, sell it, give it away. The mother had no say. So these women, these forgotten women whose names we'll never know, lived through a nightmare that most of us can't even comprehend. They were raped, impregnated, forced to give birth, and then forced to watch as their babies were taken away and killed over and over, year after year, until they were too old or too damaged to bear children anymore. And then what happened to them? Were they discarded, sold, killed themselves? We don't know, because their bodies aren't in that mass grave. Only the babies are there. This is where the story becomes not just a historical mystery, but a moral reckoning. Because for 1,600 years, nobody knew this happened. These women suffered and died in obscurity. Their babies were murdered and thrown away like garbage. And the person who did this, whoever they were, lived their life, died peacefully, and was probably mourned and honored. They got away with it completely. They were never caught, never prosecuted, never punished. They died thinking their secret was safe. And it was, until 2007, until archaeologists accidentally broke through the floor of that palace and found the evidence. And now, 1,600 years later, we know. We know what happened. We know there were victims. We know there was a killer. We just don't know the killer's name, and we never will, because too much time has passed. The records are gone. The witnesses are dead. All we have are bone, 100 tiny skeletons buried in the dark, silent witnesses to a crime that went unpunished. But here's the thing about archaeology. It gives voice to the voiceless. It uncovers truths that powerful people tried to bury. And even though we can't punish the person who killed these babies, even though we can't give them justice in any legal sense, we can remember them. We can tell their story. We can make sure the world knows what happened. And maybe, in some small way, that's a kind of justice. Not for the killer, but for the victim. Let me tell you something else that makes this story relevant today. Because this isn't just ancient history. This isn't just something that happened 2,000 years ago in a distant Roman city. This same pattern, powerful people committing crimes against vulnerable people and getting away with it because they control the system. This happens today, right now, all over the world. How many powerful men have raped their employees, their servants, their subordinates, and never faced consequences? How many have covered up their crimes? How many have used money, influence, and legal power to silence victims? And how many of those crimes will we only discover decades later, when it's too late to prosecute anyone? The details change, the technology changes, but the dynamic is the same. Power protects predators, and the victims are forgotten until someone, usually by accident, uncovers the evidence. This is why archaeology matters. This is why investigating historical crimes matters. Not because we can change the past. We can't. But because understanding the past helps us recognize these patterns in the present. It helps us see that this isn't new. It's been happening forever. And if we want it to stop, we have to be willing to confront it, to investigate, to speak up, to refuse to let powerful people hide their crimes just because they have money and influence. So let's go back to Ashkelon one more time. Let's talk about what happened after the discovery. When the archaeologists found the skeletons, they immediately contacted authorities, Israeli archaeologists, international forensic experts, historians, everyone who might be able to help understand what they'd found. The news spread quickly. Within weeks, it was an international story. Headlines around the world. 100 baby skeletons found under Roman palace. People were horrified, fascinated, demanding answers. And the archaeological team started working. They carefully excavated every skeleton, photographed them, cataloged them, sent samples to labs for DNA and isotope analysis. They treated these babies, these victims who'd been thrown away like trash 1,600 years ago, with the dignity and respect they never received in life. And slowly, piece by piece, they built the picture I've been describing to you, a picture of systematic, of powerful people exploiting vulnerable women, of babies killed to hide crimes or simply because they were inconvenient. It took years to complete the analysis. The findings were published in academic journals, debated at conferences, and the consensus among experts is that this was almost certainly infanticide on a massive scale, probably driven by a combination of factors: sexual exploitation of slaves, illegitimate pregnancies that needed to be hidden, and a society where killing babies, while officially frowned upon, was still common enough that one person could do it 100 times without being stopped. But here's something interesting. The discovery in Ashkelon isn't unique. Since 2007, similar finds have been made in other locations, smaller scale but the same pattern. Baby skeletons hidden in sewage systems, in wells, in forgotten corners of ancient buildings. Archaeologists are starting to realize that infanticide in ancient Rome might have been even more common than previously thought, and that raises uncomfortable questions about our understanding of history, because we like to think of ancient Rome as civilized, as the foundation of Western culture, law, philosophy, engineering, democracy. We learn about Roman achievements in school, but we don't learn about this. We don't talk about the dark, the cruelty, the way Rome's greatness was built on slavery, exploitation, and violence. And maybe we should. Maybe we need to tell the whole story, not to condemn the past, but to understand it, to recognize that progress isn't inevitable, that civilization is fragile, that if we're not careful, if we don't actively protect the vulnerable, we can slide backward into the same kind of horrors that characterized ancient Rome. The babies of Ashkelon can't speak. They can't tell us their names or their mothers' names or who killed them, but their bones speak. They tell a story of suffering, of injustice, of crimes that went unpunished for 1,600 years. And now finally, that story is being told, not in a courtroom, not with justice in any traditional sense, but in articles, in documentaries, in conversations, in videos like this one. The killer's name is lost to history, but the victims are remembered, and that matters. It matters because remembering the victims, giving them a voice even centuries after their death, is the only justice we can offer. It matters because telling these stories, confronting the uncomfortable truths about our past, is how we learn to do better in the present. So I'll leave you with this. Somewhere in Ashkelon, 1,600 years ago, 100 babies were murdered. Their bodies were hidden beneath a palace, and nobody stopped it. Nobody investigated. Nobody cared. Because the victims were slaves, and the killer was powerful, and that's just how the world worked. But the world doesn't have to work that way. We can choose differently. We can choose to investigate crimes even when the perpetrators are powerful. We can choose to protect vulnerable people even when it's inconvenient. We can choose to remember victims even when their names are forgotten. The babies of Ashkelon deserve to be remembered. Their mothers deserve to be remembered. And the person who killed them, whoever they were, deserves to be remembered too, not with honor, but with condemnation, as a warning, as an example of what happens when power goes unchecked, when crimes are hidden, when victims are forgotten. This is the scandal they buried for 1,600 years, the 100 babies who died in the dark, the mothers who suffered in silence, the killer who got away with murder, until 2007, when archaeologists broke through the floor and the truth finally came to light. Now you know, and you can't unknow it. If this story disturbed you, if it made you think about how power and vulnerability intersect, if it made you wonder what other secrets are still buried beneath ancient palaces, hit that like button and subscribe. Comment below. Do you think this was a brothel, a private household, or something else entirely? Let me know your theory. I'll see you in the next one.